So welcome to the Digital Economist from the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Switzerland. We are holding our inaugural roundtable and very excited to have a huge turnover and a highly curated roundtable. The Digital Economist is an impact platform focused on thought leadership and bringing investable opportunities in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals to the fore. So we're very excited to welcome folks on January 23rd this evening, and looking forward to great partnership and a lot of value we create for the community along the way. So welcome.
Good morning, evening, and afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is Navroop Sahdev, and I am the founder and CEO of the Digital Economist, which is a global impact platform building the knowledge, the services, and the products toward a human-centered digital economy. And we have a very special guest today who's been with us for over a year since the Digital Economist started, Gurvinder Ahluwalia, who's the CTO of IBM, and all of your questions, all of your interesting insights, and everything around blockchain, crypto, DeFi would be answered today. This is a Zoom webinar that we do on a weekly basis called the Speaker Series. And we also have a live broadcast on Clubhouse, and we will be moving the party to Clubhouse just in a little bit. So stay with us for everyone who's joining us on Clubhouse. So Gurvinder, thank you very much for joining. So great to have you.
Thank you, Navroop. Thank you for getting us together. And I look forward to unpacking a set of topics from our end, as well as inviting inspiration from the audience.
Exciting, yeah. And I think this is the first time we're actually also broadcasting live to Clubhouse, where of course there's a lot of action on the crypto space and the DeFi space and the enterprise blockchain space. So I think I'm just super glad that we are able to bring this live to the community, along with the attendees who are joining in here, Mihaila, Jagdeep, Kamal, and Yvonne here, who of course are great community pals and fellow experts in their own domains, and definitely intersecting blockchain and all things blockchain. So yeah, we're ready to get started, Gurvinder. Before we even kind of get into a lot of the core technology stuff, would just love to learn a little bit about yourself. What is it that got you into the space, and what is it that kind of took you from the previous waves of technology and spearheading those technologies that you were involved in to sort of the decentralized space? So we'd love to kind of learn a little bit about your background, tell us where you're from, tell us what motivates you, and we'll jump right in right after.
Yeah, thanks again, Navroop. And before I get into that, thanks so much for the audience here on the Zoom call, as well as on the Clubhouse, and we'll continue with some Q&A on the Clubhouse later as well. The inspiration that really drives me, both my career as well as my professional passions, is we bring to bear technologies for social good and social causes. Now, it might sound like that's how I started my career, but quite frankly, it wasn't. I started my career with a bookend of an infrastructure that was being put in at the dawn of TCP/IP. And when I finished my graduate studies in computer science, I ended up in a career down in Austin, Texas, with a company called Motorola, which was the darling of Wall Street at that time, and ended up installing the second largest commercial network in the routed TCP/IP world. So I feel very humbled about it, but it also gives me the benefit of hindsight to see when the industry put an infrastructure in place at that point, it was with the pure intentions of getting communication and getting files exchanged originally between researchers at universities, which is where the internet, ARPANET started. But then, of course, to other universities and then into corporations and then into consumers. And where we are in the wave currently, and then I'll step you through in some of the waves in between, is a whole new infrastructure is being plumbed. And that is to put decentralization and to put the right incentives. And while decentralization might sound like a technology topology term, it is, but at the same time, it's a very strong governance term. So now, even though I come from a technology pedigree, we commonly, you and I know at the Digital Economist and other circles where we've crossed, commonly technologists talk with, try to talk in economic terms, and economists talk quite effectively in technology terms as well. So we're no longer having a technology discussion. We are having a discussion around shared governance. We are having a discussion around the right incentive systems. We are having a discussion around the risk of persuasion technologies, and of course, data privacy. And that's brought us to the Internet of Value that is being plumbed, starting with the momentum, of course, put in place by Bitcoin. It's a great day for Bitcoiners and overall the blockchain community today when it reached a valuation of $1 trillion. I don't need to tell you about the buzz and how Twitterverse is kind of lit up, and Clubhouse as well these days. So if you look at that marker from the kind of infrastructure that was originally put in place to kind of where we are in putting in a new infrastructure in place, which is going to have incentivization to do with data, to do with control, which is going to have decentralized governance principles in place. That is a very, very significant shift, so that we don't have the risks that we have now been burdened with, and that is around, surveillance, data privacy, and centralized control. Real quick to complete your question, my stops in between have been on other waves, like the shift towards web technology, where I did the build out of large-scale e-commerce capabilities. Then my shift into the mobile era, having stewarded the development of wireless handset devices before actually the advent of iPad and iPhones, and then moving into kind of stewarding the cloud movement for self-service of compute and making compute available at ease and great scale. So we are now into kind of the convergence, just wrap up over here, of not just blockchain, but all that has happened before that, which means the waves of IoT, the waves of mobility, the waves of web-based technologies, they don't all go away, but there's a new level of incentivization and governance that becomes important for us to deliver to the industry and kind of advance the thinking on that. Let me give it back to you, Navroop.
Great. Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, Gurvinder. And for those of us who are joining here on Zoom, please ask your questions, post your questions here on the chat function. We're going to be taking those up alongside, and also folks who are joining us on Clubhouse, stay tuned there. We will be moving the party to Clubhouse shortly. And the first half of this session is a fireside chat, and then we'll open it up to everybody here. We are super keen and excited to engage everyone. Gurvinder, you've said so much here that needs unpacking, I feel. Everything from economic systems, incentives, to governance systems, kind of, on borderline politics as well, because everything is political these days. I guess that would be a fair statement. But then also technology systems. I kind of want to frame this a little bit and put it in the context of this new paper you're publishing within a day or two, and I think that the title really captured my attention, The Shock After the Shock. So maybe we can unpack that a little bit and talk about what do you mean there by that, and then kind of go a little bit deeper into a lot of the technology waves and the convergence of tech in particular that you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, thanks for giving an opportunity to share some highlights, and the paper will come out shortly. and I would love for the larger audience to read it and invite feedback. And thanks also to many others that have helped contribute towards the thinking and the paper that's coming out. Well, there are let's say two, three main highlights that I would want to point out. Number one, the thinking has been situated in the midst of the pandemic that we all are in. Now, there's enough that's been written about the economy and the pandemic that it sounded a little bit fatigued, but the intersection with technology in the two of those aspects is something that we wanted to draw on in this thinking. And that is specifically around the notion of anti-fragility. And anti-fragility, Navroop, I know you talk extensively and you've thought about this extensively yourself. I'm sure you'll have some thinking to add in just a moment, is how do we come out stronger from an event, right? So what we hear in the media, how do we come out stronger? What we hear, of course, even from politicians and other leaders, is not just a soundbite, but there are certain interesting, I wouldn't say just notions. Of course, there are whole books written on that topic, but there are also practices that have been implemented. So I'll speak with my bias and experiences from the technology side to the anti-fragility message in the paper. And that is something that was originally pioneered with all credit to the work that was done by Netflix, and incidentally, some of my colleagues from a previous company I used to work for at Sun Microsystems moved over to Netflix and really are the core of putting the architecture together at Netflix. And anti-fragility as an implementation in a technology platform like Netflix was not just implemented at Netflix, but it was then openly shared as practices and lessons to the larger technology industry. And then it started permeating into large implementations and internet properties that we commonly use today. There is something called a...
For the audience, I wonder if it might be worthwhile for us to take a step back and just very briefly talk about the notion of anti-fragility and what do you mean by that, and how does that apply to technology? Because I think that would really put sort of the example of Netflix into context.
Yeah. So anti-fragility is the ability to come out of a stressor situation with something much better than what existed prior to the situation. In fact, the human body in some times has anti-fragility. Not only is it regenerative in many aspects from injury, but when you recover from the injury, the scar tissue actually makes some of those portions stronger. Now, yes, there's the argument that scar tissue could have adverse effects, but that's an example. In the case of Netflix, and in the case of technology, anti-fragility becomes that when you are pounded by more and more concurrent users on your platforms, then it uses capability. It basically becomes more easily available because there are techniques that have been implemented at the background, like what's called elastic scale. So you can scale horizontally in terms of servers, you can scale vertically, and that gets a little bit more into the technology discussion. But there are technology techniques on how you can scale on multiple dimensions as far as storage is concerned, as far as the intervening network is concerned, as far as content accelerators are concerned between your browser or your device and the backend servers. So there's scaling happening at multiple places. But at the same time, once that load or once those stressors have been relieved, then it elastically comes down from a utilization as well as an economics kind of a cost structure standpoint as well. So basically, you now have architectures. Earlier, it used to be what I would call high availability and resilient architectures, but they were kind of resistant to change. They were resistant to bad change. Which was obviously good because you needed them to be kind of sealed and insulated for the performance. But they didn't perform very well because they were brittle if you wanted to introduce good change, right? So that's the notion of anti-fragility. I want to just, Navroop, does that answer your question? And then I'll move on to some of the other two messages in the
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think from what I'm hearing, and of course, Gurvinder, you kind of have a range of vocabulary that most of us don't. So I'm trying to make sense of it kind of in layman's term. So you're essentially saying there's this elasticity that is available under the notion, and I would say perhaps is the architecture, which is almost an antonym of anti-fragility. That we have systems that are flexible, services that are on demand, and that's the sort of thinking, and that's the sort of I guess system or systemic architecture that goes behind this. And of course, I mean, I'd really love to kind of learn before we kind of go deeper into the paper, perhaps to some degrees, but also sort of your comments on currently where the crypto space is and decentralized finance. To learn a little bit about what does that mean for, or what did that mean sort of in your experience with IBM in particular, and in sort of various different technologies. And Netflix is, I think, a great example, and you've mentioned that a few times before. Also, looking at from an end sort of last mile delivery, right? If I'm using the term correctly. So you start a song, right, on Spotify, and you could just like go out of network or signal or whatever and not have Wi-Fi, but it would keep running until the end of that particular song. So I think that is an example that registers with me, but like from a kind of a more in-depth perspective, how do you see at a back end, how are engineers designing these anti-fragile technology systems?
Yeah. So, I'll come back to the thread on the paper with another one or two highlights later. But there's a good segue, which I think I'm able to make over here in the two questions that we're talking about. One is around anti-fragility and the systems, and the other is around crypto. Let me just take half a step backwards. And we were talking about the internet plumbing that was put in place, 20, 30 years ago. Everybody knows the term HTTP because you see it on your browser all the time. So I'm not throwing anybody off in the non-technical audience, I'm sure. The reason the internet was designed the way it was is because it was designed as what's called a stateless architecture, right? So sorry to throw that term on the audience, but I think this is a very sophisticated audience. And the idea of a stateless architecture is where the state is not available to the backend machines. I'm coming up to a key point in just a moment on the move from centralization to decentralization and crypto. But you somehow had to find a way to handle state. And the way state was handled in the internet was through HTTP. HTTP is a stateless protocol. So when you're on Google or you're on Netflix.com, right, and you send one request, and then you send the second request, the first request doesn't know about the second request. The second request doesn't know about the first request, and so on and so forth. But something has to handle that those requests are coming from Navroop or from Gurvinder or from Mihaela or from anybody, and that is compensated for at the edges by the browser. Okay, that's what HTTP does. And if you've heard of cookies, cookies provide the handling of state for the backend servers then to know that this is the same person. These are 4 different requests, but they're really coming from the same person. And the reason it was stateless is a very, very important reason, so I don't want to miss that understanding, is because you restrict scale if you have statefulness, the opposite. So if you have statelessness, you can scale massively, okay? So that way, a server at the back end can satisfy a particular request and then relieve itself and then take on the next request, right? So it doesn't need to be burdened by knowing the state of the requester. Now, the problem that we ended up with by having a stateless environment like this, which was bridged with the gap, that gap was bridged by putting in cookies, is that we ended up with the whole privacy mess that we are in. Now, cookies to a point for a user experience, the way I basically described it, are of course a very, very good thing. But then cookies translate into breadcrumbs, which translate into marketing and profiling, that translates into surveillance, right? And that surveillance translates into persuasion technologies. Sorry about that. And persuasive technology is, for those of you who, I'm not an expert at it, but Stanford University is the one that spawned a center of excellence around that whole new discipline, which is what then basically, studies neurosciences, monitors your behavior, and then influences your behavior. Okay, so that brings us from the stateless internet to this morass that we are in around data privacy and persuasion, into the need for, Narup, what you're leading into the need for decentralized architectures, let me just broadly call it that way, of which cryptocurrencies are one element. So in a decentralized architecture, we no longer have control available to one entity. There are multiple things now that happen under the umbrella of decentralized technologies and families. One is around control, it's shared. The other, specifically in the context of some of our discussions over here, is around identity. And some of you might have heard the term decentralized identity, also called self-sovereign identity, right? And that's where I control the credentials of my identity. And until my identity is under my control, I cannot control my data. Now that's a key point. So let me say that again. You cannot solve the data problem without solving the identity problem, because you have to associate that data to a certain identity. So I have to first solve the identity problem, which is what the world of self-sovereign identity and DID is solving. And now I have all sorts of options that I can have. Now I have all sorts of options and applications that build on top of that. For example, the ones that are, of course, most popular these days are digital wallets. So cryptocurrencies are stored in digital wallets, and I control them, as opposed to any intervening party, and also as opposed to any censoring entity in between transactions between me and you in transferring assets. The other use case and application, and then I'll just give it back to you in just a moment. The other use case and application is around digital passports for COVID infection status. So if you look at the work that has been done by the COVID Credentials Institute, of which, Narup, thanks to you, the Digital Economist is a founding member of that open source nonprofit movement, which incidentally I might share with the audience has been merged into the Linux Foundation, particularly an initiative in the Linux Foundation called the Linux Foundation Public Health, LFPH. So you can go look up that if you want to take a little bit closer look. And some of the experts from this community, totally volunteer community, have now been, let me take this a step further to introduce a step further, have been invited into a working group at the World Health Organization, which is pretty soon, I think the expected timeline is by this summer, going to put out a schema for interoperability and exchange of digital COVID passport kind of credentials for the world to adopt. So anyway, I wanted to make, with some examples, this bridge between where we came from, where the internet was in a stateless manner, to decentralized applications like cryptocurrencies, like identity, and like digital passports. So let me give it back to you, Narup.
Gurvinder, there's a lot you said just now, again. So there's a lot to unpack here as well. So just so if I can maybe perhaps summarize or pick up some gems from in there. So you're saying the notion of anti-fragility is key and has been key in terms of what then became kind of the current internet. So there's some degree of applicability that is already available and visible. So, after the description today that you just gave, I would say I actually hate cookies a little less, because I just thought they were just surveillance, packets of data that were being sent out to my laptop. So thank you for that. So those are the ones that allow that last mile delivery, to what you just said. And so at the same time, you're saying, okay, that also leads us into this very problematic, muddy, messy situation where we don't know, how are we going to be really using identity in a way that is responsible, and governance of that data that is responsible, and at the same time, it kind of opens up this whole world, which I think in a way the world didn't know about before, right? I know one of the things you talk about in your upcoming paper is about data being both the fuel as well as the exhaust, right, for the digital economy. And all of the things you talk about, and crypto and blockchain and DeFi kind of are like further subsets to that. So what I'm hearing here is you're giving us a historic take on how we ended up in the mess we are in, first of all, and the fact that this is perhaps an emergent feature, characteristic of this system. Nobody planned out saying, okay, we will not, we will not give enough rights to people, or we will be surveying them. But in fact, we ended up in this mess in trying to make technology better, make it more personalized. But lo and behold, here we are. So now, of course, data, now governance, and all of these things have become such a critical issue. And of course, biases, they actually amplify. So I want to change gears a little bit. And of course, we can, I guess, continue talking about this for the longest time. But I know we have a lot of crypto enthusiasts and a lot of people who are bullish on blockchain. And I can see the size of our Clubhouse room is just growing. And so, tell us a little bit, take us behind your eyeballs in IBM during your time there, and sort of, I guess, what sparked kind of not staying with IBM. I guess that would be interesting to learn about as well, right? And where things stand currently in the industry.
Sure. Before I get into the crux of your question, I have a little other nugget to share for you on your cookie response and for the audience. Cookies are actually, this isn't going to happen right away, but there's a journey, and I think it's getting to a good point of standardization. Cookies are going to get replaced by something called, you ready for this? Called FLOC, Federated Learning of Cohorts. So for those of you who are tired like Navroop of cookies, and like Navroop and me of cookies, the ad industry has been trying to respond to the whole privacy thing. So it's something to look at. FLOC, right? Hashtag FLOC, Federated Learning of Cohorts, is the leading candidate to replace cookies. Let me just leave it that way. So back to your real question. The enterprise space and a little bit of the blockchain work, which I was part of the co-founding team at IBM's blockchain business. IBM actually was the first enterprise entity to enter the blockchain space, thanks to 6 other people, and in all humility, my participation with them. Most of us have probably moved on. I think a few are still around over there. And we put out some very, very seminal work, which originally came out like papers. Papers are powerful. Don't be dismissive of it. And there's one called Device Democracy, which was followed up by another one called The Economy of Things. And there were some very, very powerful thought leadership that we were able to demonstrate. And the media got wind of it, and it was covered on a cover story by The Economist magazine. And it was work that was jointly done with Samsung, and really the seminal proof of putting blockchain on intrinsically on Internet of Things kind of a situation. And this was a smart home kind of a use case on mediating the use of electricity between a TV and a washer dryer, negotiating between devices, self-negotiating between themselves to give privileges and permissions, which is called kind of arriving at a consensus that, okay, the garage door can tell the front door it's okay for you to open because this FedEx, delivery is expected or something like that. Or the garage door could open, 3 feet so the box could be, slipped in from underneath of that. But anyway, those might be moot examples, but the main point was a proof point which for the first time demonstrated outside of the cryptocurrency Bitcoin sector the use of blockchain in enterprise use cases. And then the world got lit. The media got lit, the analysts got lit, and so did the cryptocurrency, the crypto kind of world that IBM as a big powerhouse in the tech sector has jumped into it. Long story short, it was a slow and arduous journey to get blessings from the mothership to make this a real business from what started out as a skunkworks project. And that took about 2 years, I think. But eventually, that's when the IBM blockchain business was founded. And in parallel, the open source Hyperledger movement was founded. The rest is history. There's several use cases of enterprise adoption of IBM blockchain. And many back then, when I left IBM at 2017, I ran the blockchain business for from 2013-14 when we started till 2017 when I left. And that added to my portfolio of what I was already doing, and that was the CTO of cloud and IoT, and then added kind of blockchain to it as well. A lot of the work that has even come out in recent years in a referenceable manner as my early fingerprints on that. Moving to where we are now, and also some disappointments I might add, there is no notion of cryptocurrencies, in fact, even crypto tokens, I would say, in most of the enterprise blockchain space. I wouldn't just call out IBM. I think in most of the enterprise blockchain space, broadly speaking, except those that are using Ethereum, which is, I wouldn't say it's not an enterprise, it is. It's been strengthened to become an enterprise blockchain platform, and it is. But I'm alluding to the distinction that I usually don't like to call out, but I might just for simplicity over here, the distinction between public blockchain and private blockchains. So where the enterprise adoption now is most of the use cases that have been implemented, and Digital Twin Labs, my venture, implemented the use case for the global trade of diamonds on blockchain technology. In this particular case, it was on Ethereum. So there are enterprises blockchain implementations on Ethereum. However, here's the biggest downside that the enterprises are facing right now. The risk that we've ended up with is, or the reality and the risk that we've ended up in the enterprise space now is the two most important things that blockchain technology brings to the industry and to society are not being used in enterprise blockchain implementations. And those are tokenization of assets, just tokenization in general. And the second one is decentralized models of governance. And both of those, incidentally, are related. Many of the enterprise blockchain implementations that are marketed quite popularly and well known, without calling names out, are two principled governance models. It would be a technology vendor and their customer, and they would control it. So there's been a lot of strong arming to get wider adoption of smaller players from that ecosystem onto those platforms, and there remain concerns around not just governance, not just digitization of digital assets, tokenization of digital assets, but also ownership of data is the other one. So I'll just leave it over there. So the wrap up I would give to that, and Narup, I'll give it back to you. The wrap up that I would give over there is that what we are now seeing in enterprise blockchain is old silos being stood up using new technologies. So until there's a course correction to that, and there's work that in Digital Twin Labs we are doing, which are in the same industry where large technology vendors also exist. But the approach that we take is, and the example I'm thinking through is in the global container shipment industry, in the mortgage industry, in the automotive industry, is to intrinsically, right from the design stage, have the intrinsic mechanisms of tokenization and shared decentralized governance in the design from the start. Even if it is not implemented in phase 1, it would be implemented in phase 2 or phase 3, but have those in the design to start with. And I think that's really important for the future adoption and success of blockchains in enterprise settings.
Interesting.
Let me go back to you.
Yeah, so essentially you're saying that it's like you build a Ferrari, but you don't put any tires on it. Like not having tokens and not having governance, and you don't put a steering wheel, which could be, I think, a good analogy for governance. And so it's going to go all over the place. Yes, the engine's powerful. Yes, it's a new technology. Yes, it can change the game, and it is a big game changer. But you need to give it the fuel. You need to give it the tires for what really touches the ground. In this case, what is it that interacts and moves around in the system? But also the governance, which is the steering wheel in the direction that it's going, to the technology for it to actually have or bring some tangible benefits to us, both from, I guess, a technology development perspective, but also what it does for the world at large, right? So I'll get into kind of, I guess, the cost of technology a little bit. Tommaso Asse, who was one of our previous speaker series guests, talked about how, this precedence that has been set that technology is for free, but actually building tech is extremely expensive. So something is being sold, and that is our data. Of course, that's not news anymore, but just the way the business model developed. And even if now, and then we had another speaker, Harald Stieber, Tommaso from UCL Center for Blockchain Technologies, but Harald Stieber from the European Commission, a senior economist there, talked about how people are more than willing to trade off their identifying, I guess, data and private data for the sake of ease of use, for the sake of personalization. So there is this idea of people being very privacy focused. But when you see that in practice, I know you talked about that a little bit in the paper, which just a teaser out there, I guess. But do sign up for our newsletters to be the first one to read these papers, and eventually we also platform them on our website, and you can find the link to that in my Clubhouse bio, but also at thedigitaleconomist.com/Center of Excellence if you're joining us on the Zoom call. And so you talked about how, Gurvinder, back to that point, the what people believe and what they actually do in practice seem to be two different things.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a behavioral problem. I wonder if that's a technology problem. What would you comment on that?
Well, when the price is free, you're the product.
Interesting. I think that sums it up.
So we are the product in Facebook. We are the product in Google. We are the product in many of these social networks. And not only have we adopted them, we are anthropologically attached to them. Our friend Jose Paramayano, he contributed some very good thoughts that'll be in the paper as well on what he's written about even previously quite extensively, commonly referred to as the privacy paradox. And people say that they want privacy of their data and their behavior, but when they actually go online, their actions don't demonstrate what they are saying. So that's the gap, that's the paradox that he talks about. We discussed that a little bit in the paper as well, but we don't leave it at that. We look at data cooperatives kind of models to try to solve that problem. I mentioned the leading candidate that might replace cookies, and we'll see how that is addressing the problem, even though those platforms will remain to be centralized. And then another third angle towards the solution is incentivization, basically the use of tokens to share data. And then the fourth one, and kind of just summarizing the threads that we have scattered over here, the fourth one is the use of sovereign, self-sovereign identity, digital decentralized identity to then be able to control what data I share for exchange or what kind of incentive. So we have to look at the future world from a different lens of how the transactions are. I mean, we are on Clubhouse and we are now seeing how the nature of interaction, quickly just rockets once the opportunity comes to the market. And really the nature of interactions is what we have to focus on in our dealings with digital, in our dealings with in a digital economy. We can't take old forms of transactions and try to move those into the modern future digital economy, because they're going to be very, very different. And for those new transactions, we need different mechanisms for interaction. We need different and very, very rapid mechanisms for identifying, for credentialing, for exchanging data, for finding what the right value is for exchange. I mean, that has to happen very, very quickly, even in advanced use cases that are being considered for autonomous vehicles. Some work that Digital Twin Labs has done with a German automotive manufacturer. We ran the hackathon for them in Europe. Is how do you negotiate in a busy intersection? How do you negotiate rights to passage based on an incentive mechanism that I'm willing to exchange with the surrounding traffic around me, right? Why can't every vehicle in a time of need, and Texas is just coming out of this minus 11 degrees, minus 20 degrees, snow and power outages, why can't every vehicle, if it needs to become an emergency vehicle immediately, which means it should have the right of passage, and I should be able to negotiate the rights to passage based on an incentive mechanism that can be delivered right away. So when you have those scenarios, then you need new instruments for negotiation, for exchange, for cryptocurrencies, because the fiat currency can't do those kind of exchanges in the speed and the scale that we are talking about. So that's the privacy paradox, that people's behavior is very different from what they are actually saying in terms of protecting their privacy. But I think we have to give society and people tools with the right granularity. It's not a binary situation that I want to share my data or I don't want to share my data. I think most people, if I were to, at the risk of generalization, are going to be somewhere in the middle, because people do realize the advantage of sharing data and there are acceptable trade-offs. But how do we negotiate? How do we arbitrate? How do we exchange that value rapidly? So I'll just wrap up with on this topic with one of the messages around kind of measurements and taxonomy on how we should look at this future differently and the future kind of digital economy differently. We all understand economic measurements in terms of industry verticals, right? I mean, housing and consumer durables and retail, and you hear on CNBC or wherever quite commonly, and from the Federal Reserve Bank, numbers coming out of it. We also use very commonly economic measurements based on geographies, right? From US and China, based on countries, based on economic regions like the European Union, based on trade-free zones like in Africa, where one of the largest ones is now coming up. And similarly, I think Asia and some other parts have it. But we can't take those and then expect it to apply to the modern digital economy. We have to look at it differently. And 3-4 that we point out in the paper are, how do we look at it from the taxonomy that here's an automated economy, right? Which is run by, unattended by highly automated machines like robotic factories, right? What are the measurements and characteristics and the growth of that economy? We have to look at it from a presence economy, which means, non-physical human presence or remote conduct or participation, something like that. We have to look at it so that's a presence economy. I don't have to be physically present over there. We have to look at the physical economy, meaning like supply chain, like physical goods that can't be digitized have to be moved, right? We'll have to look at those. And then a last category we talk about is kind of the person economy, where the physical presence of a person and an individual is actually absolutely required over there. And then we begin to have measurements and organize around one of those being, those being one of the frameworks. Then we are able to apply a more accurate, granular kind of a lens to the new industry. And it's going to be less about the discussion of, how many jobs are being displaced as a result of AI and automation and those kind of things. We just need new dashboards and new measurements on the economy. Back to you, Navroop.
Yeah, Gurvinder, there's again so much you've covered there that I'd really kind of love to go so much deeper into. But to your point on sort of the taxonomy, which is I think it's really novel, and I can't wait to read the paper and share it with the community as well through the Digital Economist platform. Is this taxonomy that you present, and I think there are insights and lessons there. Not just about, okay, how do we split the economy in new different parts, but also how do we treat different groups of people, different systems. And I think you brought up a really important point, which was on institutions. And yesterday I was on this conversation with Mark Andreessen and Tyler Cohen, who's an economist, and they were talking about how institutions, they become redundant over time. So if you're a software company, there is an update that goes out every 3 months or so. When was the last time our legal institutions had an overhauling, or our immigration, institutions? So over time, so for example, there's a bonus structure in a company. The first year will be a huge motivator for an employee, for example, but 10 years down the line, that's not really going to be the case. So anything kind of gets old and needs to be revived and things like that. And I think would that be fair to say that there's a strong sort of flavor of that to what you captured in the paper, to the sort of future we need for a human focused economy, particularly in the digital realm where we play, I guess. And that requires a component of education that you just talked about, on us presenting those choices, the entire spectrum of those choices to the public, and to an informed audience, informed users, honestly, community polled. And these are really the people who are building the content, if you may, for companies like Facebook and others, where we as humans are the product. And at the same time, also kind of thinking through and working through, again, in a decentralized and inclusive way, the new problems we face around data governance, around the choices that are present to us. Technology obviously is at a massively different place than where it was just 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, Navroop, absolutely. Where we are is there's no turning back from technology. I think everybody will easily accept that. There's whether we have a love-hate relationship, but there's no turning back from it. And I'd like to put that in a more grounding perspective. There never was a turning back from technology when man discovered fire. There never was a turning back from technology when the wheel was invented. There never has been a turning back from technology from the Industrial Revolution. And there certainly isn't going to be a turning back from technology from the frontiers that are being pushed today. So I think we should easily agree with that. And if we agree with that, what we are left with is a dialectic exchange between humans and technology. It shouldn't be between technologists and non-technologists. It should be between humans and technology. And the dialectic exchange is one where we learn from the arguments of each other. And there are valid arguments from just talking about those two disciplines. And in fact, I don't mean to dismiss other disciplines like economics, particularly talking to you, Navroop, or
all good. A lot to learn from the technologists, indeed.
or other, sociology, which, when is the last time that any technologist looked at sociology? Last time I studied sociology was probably in my 9th grade. but now I begin to understand, a little bit more about its use in kind of the technology future. So that dialectic exchange between humans and technology, and other disciplines is really, really very important to the path that we are on to over here. Let me just close from my end with a point that you were alluding to around institutions. Whichever way you look at where technology, let me just call it in convergence, is today, I'm alluding a little bit with more emphasis towards decentralized technologies, because those have been massively disruptive, not just technologically, economically, but also socially. But let me put it in perspective, and you can go examine it from Coase's theory of the firm, and there is value in bringing in these technologies from a transaction cost standpoint, right? You can go examine it from the work that Carlota Perez has done, the professor out of Argentina, whose work, Naru, you would be closer to knowing from your expertise in economics. I'm just a computer scientist. And that is the prediction that, not only disruptions happen, but they're actually predictable, right? It just happens that people like you and me and all of us are witnesses. In many cases, we are not just witnesses, we are actual practitioners in this movement. And then you go on, back to the point on institutions, and then you go on to more recent work that has been done earlier in the century, when Doug North was given the Nobel Prize for his work on institutional economics, I believe it's called. And the idea, you really can embellish this better. I'm not the expert on this, but I learn it only to the extent that it becomes relevant for me to be reminded as a technologist, that institutions are not as important as the function that they are delivering. It's not the government, it's the governance, right? It's not the entity, but it's the function that the entity delivers that is most important. Now, if we combine that with the technology side, and those functions can be delivered through autonomous, through automated, through scripted, through smart contract ways, then that begins to relook. I wouldn't say eliminate, I will say relook and reorder the role of those institutions in these networks and platforms that are being put together, and protocols. So we basically have to relook at the role of institutions in the future that is being prepared.
Wow, yeah, I think, Gurvinder, that's a very, very powerful message right there. The fact that we shouldn't obsess about the embodiment or the tangible institution itself, but really look through what function do they perform for us, and if there's a better way to perform that function. So, I kind of have a follow-up on that. Before we move the conversation to Clubhouse in 5 minutes, where everybody can ask their questions live, my follow-up would be, does that mean we should throw the current institutions you have out of the window? What would you recommend in terms of the actual implementation of perhaps better institutions, and perhaps more trustworthy institutions? We actually didn't get to talk about DeFi at all. So, if that sort of figures in somewhere, or Gurvinder, we could take it to Clubhouse in the next 5 minutes. But what is the course of action for policy for us as a informed electorate towards that end?
In full disclosure, I'm not an expert in policy writing. I've been privileged to give a few talks at the Federal Reserve in Philly, Federal Reserve Bank here in Dallas, and a few of those kind of august institutions. The debate around the role of central banks is around cryptocurrencies is of course being discussed, but I think the larger discussion is around the role of financial institutions in future capital markets, which is exactly, I don't mean to push the conversation in over here, which is exactly where the whole DeFi narrative is really coming in. And
right.
just like I was talking about the build out of a TCP/IP communication network, 30 years ago, to the build out of an information network, to the build out of, the value trust network. There's a build out of a capital markets network that is happening. Most of it, of course, is right now happening on top of Ethereum. I think sometime around June, the market valuation of that network was around $1 billion, and I think right now it's probably easily over 50 billion. I'm just talking about the DeFi space on Ethereum in terms of the valuation of their tokens, and the amount of capital locked in over there. A lot of it in cryptocurrency terms is in hundreds of billions, if not touching $1 trillion or something. That is locked up in smart contracts. So it's a nascent market that is happening, as they say, how does change happen? Gradually, and then suddenly. For those who are deeply steeped into it, they will know far more than I do, but that's where the primitives, kind of the first principles around capital, markets are being put in place, which otherwise were, in closed doors and esoteric expertise and brain trusts of investment banks and other institutions in Wall Street. And that is, the primitives. Let's put in place, lending mechanisms, automated kind of market making. Let's put in place the primitives of, fixed rate loans and margining and interest rate swaps, collateralized kind of lending. So basically putting some fundamentals in place, and there are, hundreds of DeFi, mind you, many of them bad actors also, so be careful, that are being implemented. Many of them very, very, with very, very reputed backers behind them. And the idea being, it's been described as a composable, financial market. I wouldn't describe it necessarily as composable, because composable technologies have existed for the last 10 years. But it is an environment where the technology is being developed in the open. And the biggest thing is that there is transparency to transactions that are happening, which otherwise, well, we all went through the whole Wall Street bets and the squeezes recently. And large part of it was because there was opacity. So all this is being done with transparency to transactions and data in these DeFi projects for future capital markets. So I'll just leave it over there. Navru, give it back to you for any last questions or wrap up.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gurvinder. This is tremendous. And I think not only have you talked about technologies, I think we've surfaced a lot of insights that are applicable to governing of systems, the role of institutions, a lot of society, sociology, data governance, and really I think it comes down to the usage of data and really educating and involving people in those processes, I would say. So with that, I will just call it out a little closing of our webinar here on Zoom as we move the party to Clubhouse, where we'll bring other speakers to the stage. Once again, my name is Navroop Sahdev, and you can reach us at info@thedigital.economist.com or just explore at thedigital.economist.com. And I am being joined by Gurvinder Ahluwalia, CTO. I'm sorry, CEO would have been really nice, Gurvinder.
CEO of Digital Twin Labs. So
there you go. Of course, you're CEO at IBM and also advisor to the Gates Foundation. And of course, Gurvinder wears many hats, also a council member at the Digital Economist. So his new paper is coming out shortly, and we discuss some of those insights. With that said, thank you everyone for joining today for our weekly Zoom webinar series. And we will see you next week, the same time.